Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Path Towards Remembrance. After a short break, I think over a month and a half, I haven't been recording anything. I'm back with a couple of interesting videos that I will be recording over the next couple of weeks. Last time we were talking about the self-healing and how self-healing is also connected to the urea flows that have been coming throughout most of April, bringing very interesting shifts and changes in our bioenergetic anatomy. And today I would like to speak about a certain important aspect of the self-healing that I think each one of us that is on that conscious path of self-healing should complete at some point. And that is the inner child. The inner child that for some of you is perhaps already very well embraced. And maybe for some of you, this video will help you realize what other things perhaps you would like to look into, and how to exactly deal with different inner child fragmentations, which are basically parts of ourselves that have been stuck in time during our childhood, not necessarily in this lifetime actually, but could be also in other incarnations, and how exactly we are supposed to retrieve those parts of ourselves in a very effective way so that we can keep moving forward. Because very often different inner child fragmentations are the ones that are not allowing us to flow through our timeline in the way that we would like. So we're actually going to start with a definition in itself. What is the inner child? What is, in a way, its function? Because I don't think many of us realized how important that inner child is. Like, there's lots of healers and there's lots of spiritual people that are using that term. Or like maybe you have that inner child fragmentation, or like perhaps a certain chronic illness that you're suffering from is a result of the inner child. But what is that really? And where is that inner child fragmentation coming from? We're going to take a look at a couple of interesting matters. And I've had to do with a lot of inner child healings from a lot of different perspectives. So I will share a couple of examples with you today to make it more understandable. And hopefully, you will also find this video helpful for your own self-healing path. So I'm going to share the screen and show you the presentation. And we're going to speak today about the inner child integration. Sometimes the inner child integration may be a little bit complex if you had a challenging childhood in this lifetime. And sometimes you don't really know where to start. And I've had quite a lot of clients like this, kind of not knowing where to begin that healing process from. But it's good to kind of always make a list of like a couple of milestones from your childhood that you remember and start with those. Very often when we are kind of touching base on those most, let's say, transformative, most impactful moments in your life, then we kind of start that domino effect where the rest of other fragmentations may not be that difficult to clear at all. So this is like a small recommendation I would have. However, there are also cases where there's a lot of us that don't remember much from our childhood. I've known a couple of individuals, and maybe you also had that you remember your childhood, let's say from the age of 8 or from the age of 10. And that means that there's certain things that could have been literally erased from your memory, theoretically, of course, to prevent you from getting an access to those memories. So in a way, going through that inner child integration is almost like a small personal investigation that we are performing on a personal level. And we are trying to investigate and find those different aspects of our inner child, which are actually also aspects of our soul essence. And we need to find a good way to bring them back. So let's first take a look. What is the inner child, or more like what is that soul area that is referred to as the inner child? Because as I said in the beginning, our inner child is an indelible aspect of our soul anatomy, of our soul matrix. The term inner child refers directly to the area of the soul matrix responsible for growth and development of the incarnating spirit essence. That includes the physical growth of the body vessel, but also development and embodiment of the light body structure and its interface with the external holographic reality. Inner child quantum is progressively uploaded and accreted until age 33, when the entirety of the personal spirit essence quantum should be fully integrated. So technically that means that by that age 33, each one of us should have already integrated almost like all of our inner child quantum. But usually that doesn't happen because of something referred to as the ancestral imprint that we will talk about in a moment. And what happens is that certain imprints that come across throughout our inner child pathway, they are almost like chasing us through the entirety of our life. And they almost serve as blockages that don't allow us to move forward. I mean, there's many different individuals who struggle with lack of validation throughout their life. And then if you were to ask them where is this coming from, when did that lack of validation start, they would probably tell you that it started very early when they were still children, when they were still very young. So the inner child plays a very great role, especially when it comes to the development of our personality, of our characteristics, because our personality and the way we are is mostly supposed to derive from our spirit. There are certain things that we inherit from our ancestors through so-called ancestral imprint, that is located within the 8-cell cluster of within the tailbone area in the lower back. And that ancestral imprint at first is that dominant force that is, allowing us to have basically traits similar to our parents. But then there's also that the moment the fetal integration process takes place and the spirit starts to tether into the body, that's when we also start to have traits of our own. And as time progresses, we should progressively transmute that ancestral imprint in order to get in more of that spirit essence. And that is allowing us to shape our personality, cross any kind of limitations, and be able to be not like a clone of our parents, but literally the very individuation of our own spirit essence. So certain fragmentations that are taking place during that early stages of life are actually having a very fundamental impact on what happens next in our lives. And some of the manifestation blockages or like this lack of self-esteem, they are very often coming from the inner child. And sometimes they might go this far that you might feel like you have so many blockages in your life and you are not able to move on, and then you have all sorts of different, even like physical afflictions starting to happen. For example, the thyroid dysfunctions are very common traits of the inner child being almost like stuck. Those fragmentations are basically creating blockages in our later stages of life. And for that reason, looking and healing our inner child is a fundamental aspect of the inner healing work. So let's see where that inner child is located. The inner child area of the soul is located in the heart space, chakra 4, and it is one of the most essential aspects of the soul matrix anatomy. It is the area where all virtue core flows come together, meaning that through the full embodiment of the personal inner child, an incarnating identity activates its moral compass. It intuitively knows what is right, in alignment with the divine order of the cosmoverse, and what is wrong, not in alignment with the divine order. So that means that technically, if our inner child is fully aligned with our multidimensional anatomy, there is that intuition that perfectly gets turned on, and we know what is right to do on our timeline and what kind of decisions we should make. So in a way that integration of the inner child is also allowing us to to fully embody the spectrum of the 144 virtues of the Highland Heavens, and of course, applying them in our reality. When it comes to the main factors that influence the inner child, we can see them on the following slides that I am presenting to you. And we are going to briefly go through each one of those. The reason why the inner child is and its healing is also so important is because our nervous system is starting to develop and it's continuing its development through the first, let's say, up to 20 years of life. And so that means that technically, if you want to change or affect anything about someone's nervous system, the best way to do it is that when it's still growing, when the potentials of neuroplasticity are very, very accessible. So for that reason, a lot of different mind control agendas that we will speak about in a moment are actually starting at that very early stage of life, because this way, if you want to design a new personality, theoretically, the best way is to do it starting from the early childhood, when you can still direct the growth of neurons in a certain way. So that's why most of these trauma programs are happening so early. And there is that unconscious trauma mechanism that we will speak about. This is also why those agendas are taking place at such an early stage. However, let's begin with the ancestral imprint. And what is its actual role when it comes to the inner child? The ancestral imprint are the imprints that are passed through the biological mother and father's morphogenetic field, and they have a direct impact on the personal development of the incarnating identity, since, as I said previously, the ancestral imprint is located within the 8-cell cluster. And for those of you that are not aware, the 8-cell cluster is located within our tailbone. And the 8-cell cluster is basically representing the first 8 primordial cells that have been created prior to after the conception point. And those are the cells that never get replaced. Those are the cells that never die. Our cells are being replenished every 8 years or so, but those first 8 primordial cells, they always stay. And they are holding something referred to as the primordial blueprint for health. That is basically in a way, almost like directing all the biological functions of our body. So if we want our body to stay healthy, we need to make sure that our 8-cell cluster is functioning properly. And now here is where the ancestral imprint comes to the game, because the ancestral imprint is almost like an overlay that is placed on the 8-cell cluster. And that ancestral overlay, let's say if some of your ancestors from your family had died of cancer, let's say that would be the liver cancer. So that means that you may have an overlay of the ancestral imprint over your 8-cell cluster that carries that genetic potential of the liver cancer. So if you do not want to get sick yourself, you need to clear that overlay from your 8-cell cluster as well, obviously. All the ancestral curses, DNA distortions, and all sorts of diseases are directly passed on to the next generation, which is an aspect of the vicious wheel of incarnations agenda. These morphogenetic imprints serve as overlay in one's personal template structure, making the spirit essence repeat the story of its ancestors, which is a result of the over-repeating patterns due to the identity picking up and absorbing the same overlays as its relatives instead of aiming to fulfill its own incarnational purpose. So that means that ancestral imprint is in a way that obstacle that is almost standing on your way towards fulfilling your own potential, the one that, each one of us is kind of like coming here to do something, to accomplish something, whether that's like just the transformation of your identity, which is already a great thing, whether that's the integration of your past selves, or perhaps some kind of a service that you're supposed to do for humanity. Each one of us has a certain work that needs to be done here, and the ancestral imprint is often preventing us from it. And we don't only have the ancestral imprint, but we also have the other ancestral lines within that blueprint of the 8-cell cluster. Meaning that those other ancestral lines may include the imprints picked up through the ancestral imprint of the biological parents, but also we have the ancestral lines that we incarnated into before. So let's say if you are, I don't know, if you come from Sweden, but somehow you carry the ancestral imprints of some family lines from Scotland, even though your Swedish family doesn't have any Scottish lineage, that's still possible. Because if you incarnated a few centuries back into a Scottish family line and you never really transmuted that ancestral imprint, that means that you still carry it as an overlay that is brought in by the spirit the moment it incarnates into the body. And that means that you might potentially want to, and obviously not work through those imprints, but effectively clear them from your body so that you do not have to carry them with you anymore. So this is just something important to understand about the ancestral imprint that I need to make clear here. You are not meant to be a savior to any kind of family line and, suffer and, allow all these ancestral imprints to manifest in form of diseases, misfortune, and such. You are meant to effectively transform it in order to provide that healed blueprint for the rest of your family members that also would like to clear such ancestral imprint for themselves. So there is like a small difference here. So the other ancestral lines, they also make a difference. That's why it's always important to kind of look into that 8-cell cluster and make sure that you clear all the overlays. And the very effective way to do it is through the urea flows that we talked about in the previous video. We also have the imprints from past lifetimes. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we have the inner child aspects from this lifetime, but you might also have imprints from other lifetimes. For example, there's a lot of that inner child fragmentation that I have detected while working on the DNA and such. And there's been that, in the past, there's been a lot of trauma when it comes to different diseases. And many of us are carrying the traumatic imprints of different pandemics from other lifetimes. For example, the smallpox, which in the past was a very deadly disease for children. And also there was a completely different approach to diseases in the past. I mean, usually if someone got sick, then there would be that belief that they were either cursed or they are being possessed by some evil force. And obviously then there was a lot of different rituals and exorcisms, not always so good, but they would always kind of leave an imprint of trauma on the child having to go through all these rituals, or someone thinking that there is like literally a devil trying to enter their bodies. And you can only imagine how traumatic that could have been for a child. So this is just a small example. However, those different imprints of illnesses have left quite a big remark on the inner child structure. So the past experiences of the inner child integration directly influence all future integrations. Various mental, emotional imprints of abandonment, lack of validation, loneliness, and such may have an influence on the inner child development, very often disrupting the whole process. Usually, various trapped aspects from past incarnations may be projecting directly to the other aspects, distorting their own process of the inner child fragmentation. And sometimes the negative experiences from childhood that you had in this lifetime might be as well a repetition from another lifetime. The next aspect, the next factor that influences the inner child is something referred to as spirit intent, which is a personal mission or intention of the spirit essence for a certain incarnation. An incarnating identity is supposed to follow the primal intention of the spirit, and it progressively learns about it during its spiritual integration process. So, as I said, it is referring to that, let's say, intention, not necessarily, we don't have to call it a mission. It is referring to that intention that the inner child basically may have certain intuitive feelings about. So sometimes as children, we might dream like, oh, I want to do this in the future, I want to do that. And then the 3D reality comes in and those dreams are kind of being ruined. So it's important, like if any of you are still kind of wondering, what is my mission? What am I supposed to do here? Try to go back to your inner child and actually ask your inner child what was that first thing that it wanted to do before the other overlays came in. The next factor is the grid area. And that is referring to the fact that we are born with certain codes within our DNA template, and those codes are corresponding to, of course, other planets and stellar systems if you are a star seed, but they might be also referring to, the locations, the physical locations on this planet. So technically, if you were born in Australia, you are supposed to anchor your codes there, so it would be a good thing if you were born there. However, when we are dealing with the fallen timeline phenomena, which I was talking about a very long time ago, that means that you might not be born in a place where you belong. For example, you might be born in England while you were meant to be born in Spain, and that means that there is like a certain lack of resonance between the coding, and you might, for example, feel drawn to incarnate to visit Spain and maybe live in Spain because this is where your coding originally belongs. So this is also like an important factor, how co-resonant you are with the location where you live. And finally, we have the mind control agendas. And they are basically aimed, as I mentioned a little bit in the beginning, that is related to the growth of the nervous system and the fact that if there is anything that potentially disturbs the development of the nervous system in very early stages of life, that almost leaves like a traumatic imprint in your unconscious and subconscious mind. And one of such factors is trauma. Trauma is basically a frequency that freezes the neurons. And then we have something referred to as miasms in our nervous system, and they are a result of those different inner child fragmentations that got stuck to begin with because of the imprint of trauma. So we'll speak more about that unconscious trauma mechanism in the next slides. So these are those main factors that influence the inner child. Ancestral imprint, other ancestral lines, imprints from past lifetimes, and that might as well include like the attempts to integrate the inner child before. Spirit intent, that main plan that we have for a certain lifetime. Grid area and the coding that we have in our template, as well as the mind control agendas. And now, before we get to that longer part about the trauma mechanism, let's take a look at the various aspects of the inner child fragmentation. What are they? And perhaps that will bring you like a certain idea what some of your traumas might be. So, the first aspect of the inner child fragmentation is trauma in itself, and that might refer to perhaps the experience of the domestic abuse experienced in childhood. And very often it's kind of orchestrated behind the scenes by the fallen angels that the parents are having possession problems and the entity wants to get to the child, but it's projecting through the parents first in order to almost create like a gateway, like an entry to the body of that identity that is being traumatized. So very often these different traumas that we are experiencing in childhood are influencing the emotional body structure and further development of the nervous system. Trauma from childhood have a different impact on adulthood. Many individuals in later stages of life decide to become parents, since they are subconsciously aware of the inner child fragmentation that can be healed through the mirroring process. This means that through raising their children in a different way from previous generations, parents progressively heal the impact of the ancestral imprint and release it from the future generations. So basically, the concept of the trauma is very wide when it comes to the inner child. This might be also like different traumas related to abductions, for example, all of them that we'll speak about in a moment. But basically, through conscious timeline transformation, all of these traumas can be healed. So very often, a very useful tool is basically just going back in time to your childhood, to a certain moment where that you would like to change or heal in any way. And that adult version of yourself, talking to your inner child and assuring it that it is feeling good, that it is safe, that it is looked after, especially if you felt like you had nobody to rely on at that time. This can be very, very, very healing for your inner child to do. The next type of the fragmentation of the inner child is the womb trauma. And I can give an example myself of what I have experienced when I was in the womb. So what happened is that I was supposed to have a twin, actually, but along with me incarnating, and that twin of mine that was supposed to come with me, we were like supposed to be twin sisters. There was like an impostor spirit that tried to basically hijack the two of us. And that was almost already like the battle in the womb that was taking place. And basically, me and my twin sister connected our quantum in order to get rid of that impostor spirit. The second fetal body didn't survive, so that's why my sister told me this time you are coming in. I'm going to have my time to fulfill whatever mission I'm supposed to do. And basically, this is also something that kind of created like a certain feeling of not feeling exactly safe. So that's why I was born actually later than I was supposed to, because I prefer to stay in the womb rather than coming out to this world and kind of being in that fear of someone coming after me. So this is like a certain subconscious trauma that I did have to heal. So I just felt like sharing this story to give you like a certain idea what might be happening. Also, something to be aware of is that there might be a certain transfer of traumas from the mother to the child while during the period of pregnancy already, because the two are connected with each other through the umbilical cord. So that means that any kind of traumas and imprints that the mother is experiencing, they are basically coming through the umbilical cord to the child. So if there's been like a lot of trauma that that came from the mother, it is good to buffer that umbilical cord so that you make sure that you are not being affected by these energy imprints. The next aspect are abductions, and they are obviously an aspect of the ET agenda, the secret space program, that targets individuals either with the desired DNA or the desired blood type, or incarnational history, basically that an incarnational history that might be very unique, that might be very special, and that souls that had like very significant lifetimes, like as popular people and such, or like certain individuals that made a difference, they are being targeted already like on a soul level, even before they incarnate, to prevent them from being able to successfully embody. Anyway, let's get back to abductions. So this may involve physical or astral abductions, which usually include stealing genetic material, DNA modifications, or experimentation that usually target the nervous system. And identity is usually absolutely unaware that such abductions occurred, since they are usually blank slated, which means completely wiped out of the mental body structure, or due to the traumatic imprints, the conscious identity pushes them down into the subconscious and unconscious mind stations. Blocked memories of childhood or personal gifts that are blocked from activating are usually a result of abductions. So the abductions, not many of us are remembering them, because usually they're being pushed into the unconscious and we are becoming more aware of them in later stages of life. Another aspect are the mind control programs, which are very often used among different ancient royal bloodlines. And perhaps if any of you are maybe like more distantly connected to certain royal bloodlines, that might be another source of targeting that, because of your coding, they might want to make sure that you never come to your full power in order not to stop those royal bloodlines from fulfilling their plans on Earth. So as I said before, the mind controls usually start at a very early stage of childhood to structure development of the neuronal networks in a desired way to trigger certain behaviors and to shut down other aspects of it. For example, to block certain abilities, very often metaphysical abilities, or to decrease the IQ levels. Such programming may involve traumatizing the targeted identity through the external stimuli, for example, the increased light and sound, brainwashing, different holograms, subliminal messages, or different mind-altering substances. Such actions are usually performed without the conscious knowledge of the identity and may only be discovered in later stages of life, and they need to be progressively healed, because otherwise they are almost creating like another phase lock in our brain. And then we have the sexual reversals, which are basically meant to entrap our divine feminine and masculine. They might be also referring to the sexual traumas experienced during childhood. And speaking of that, we are going to go now through the unconscious processing of the inner child imprints and how this entire process of trauma works, and why are there certain traumas we do not remember, especially in childhood. So I'm going to be, I based it on a certain example that should be tangible enough to give us an idea on how this works. And maybe that will give you a certain clue whether you have such traumas yourself. So let's take a look. On the first step, the trauma occurs, and identity experiences a highly stressful event that triggers a traumatic response. Trauma runs through the neuronal networks, highly affecting them and shaping further future responses. So let's go through this example that I will be presenting to you in order to give you an idea on how this actually works. For example, a 5-year-old experiences sexual abuse by her uncle while being given a mind-altering substance. So there's the presence of drugs, and then there's that sexual abuse, which is meant to entrap the divine feminine of that girl. So, when the trauma happens, the imprint of the trauma starts to run through the brain. During the traumatic event, an identity experiences overload of the neuronal networks due to the brain trying to handle the high-level stress response. The entire body goes through a severe shock shortly after the trauma or during it. So that means that the trauma runs through the brain, and the trauma is very, very heavy. It's almost like it starts to overload the nervous networks, and our brain is trying to preserve energy. It's trying to save itself. And that's why it progressively starts to shut down certain parts of our nervous system, and it's moving the trauma down to the lower subharmonics of our brain in order to progressively fragment that trauma into smaller pieces and start to process them. So let's go back to this example. while experiencing the sexual abuse, the 5-year-old girl experiences several traumatic emotional responses, which may be either increased or decreased due to mind-altering drugs running through the bloodstream. Usually the drugs are almost like making us not remember that trauma, but they are heavily imprinting it in our unconscious mind. And when the trauma becomes too much for the brain, when the nervous system feels like it's becoming too much to handle, the trauma goes into the unconscious. At some point during the nervous system overload, the limbic brain triggers activating its survival mechanism. In order to protect the integrity of the entire system, some aspects of the neuronal networks get shut down. The traumatic imprint gets downstepped from the D3 conscious mind to D2 subconscious and D1 unconscious mind stations, to be later fragmented into smaller parts of the experience, each one usually corresponding to one of the 5 senses. So that means that you will not remember the full experience because it's literally going to get fragmented. So like, I don't know, if you had some traumatic memory that you don't remember, but you always get triggered by like a metal music, like a very heavy metal music. Well, it's possible that during that experience that you do not remember, someone was playing that metal music to you, and you only remember that you start to feel very anxious and uncomfortable when you're listening to metal music, but you don't even realize that your unconscious is almost like going through the same trauma again because it's triggered by the same stimulus of that disturbing trauma, of that disturbing metal music. So that's kind of how it works. There's those different stimuli coming from the 5 senses that are serving as potential triggers to almost like relive the experience. But we never know what that experience is if it gets stuck in our subconscious. So in the following example, after the traumatic experience of the sexual abuse, the 5-year-old girl may not remember what happened. The memory of the abuse was pushed down into her unconscious since it was too much to handle. And usually it happens during childhood, especially because that's when our nervous system is still developing, and such trauma can be way too much for such a young body. And of course, the mind-altering drugs have a direct impact on that process. And that's when the inner child fragmentation takes place. The traumatic imprints get stuck in the unconscious mind, causing permanent brain changes. And that's because a fragment of that identity gets stuck because of the traumatic experience. The identity's behavioral patterns may change without the identity itself being aware of it. An identity may become sensitive to certain external stimuli that may remind it of the traumatic event on a very deep level. For example, the 5-year-old girl may struggle with anxiety, even though she cannot trace its source. She now prefers wearing jeans. She was wearing a dress when the event happened. So obviously she's like, oh, I don't want to wear a dress because I don't want anyone to get attracted to me because I don't want to go through that traumatic experience again. And whenever she rides in a car that is black, she feels uncomfortable because the abuse took place inside of the black car. So small triggers like that might make her feel anxious and uncomfortable because there is a part of her that remembers, that keeps the memory of that traumatic experience, and by avoiding to wear a dress or avoiding to get into a black car, her unconscious believes that if she takes those preventive measures, she will protect herself from going through such a traumatic experience again. The traumatic imprint remains dormant until it gets triggered again by a set of similar external stimuli that come together and lead to an overload of the neuronal networks again. The trauma may then be consciously retrieved by an identity, or it may trigger the same emotional reaction without the imprint itself. For example, the 5-year-old girl 12 years later goes to a party and gets drunk. So she's under the influence of an external substance, just like she was 12 years ago. She ends up having a sexual interaction with someone whose face resembles her uncle's, and he's wearing similar clothes. And the encounter takes place in a similar location, car in the woods. This triggers a severe emotional reaction because she has so many different external stimuli, that external triggers that are so similar to the experience that she has gone through, that it almost becomes too much to handle. And a part of her feels like she's going through the same experience again. But the only good thing about it is that the experience comes back in a way to her conscious mind once it's triggered by enough of that external stimulus, so that she can work on healing that experience. So this is why basically we don't remember some of our traumatic experiences, especially in childhood. But as we go through the process of the inner child healing, it is very important to basically go back to them and consciously re-embrace them. So on this chart, we can see the main areas of the body that are affected by the inner child imprints. And as I said, if there is like a certain disease that seems not to be healed by any kind of medicine or even natural herbs and things like that, it's worth looking whether there's a certain inner child fragment there that might be causing discomfort. For example, we have the solar plexus and the sacral chakra. And these are the areas of the body where the traumatic imprints that got stuck in the mental and emotional body collect. Then we have the back of the head and the spinal cord, which are related to the traumatic imprints, which have been pushed down into the subconscious, back of the head and unconscious spinal cord, stations of mind. Whoops, I went a bit too far. Okay. So there might be a case where, especially if you have like a lot of traumas that you don't remember, that there might be lots of pain on the back of the head, because those traumas need to be released from the body. Then we have the digestive system, which is like the second brain of the body and the station of emotional awareness. Suppressing emotions, going through nervous breakdowns, or being unconscious of certain emotional imprints may lead to digestive problems. Like if you have a problem with digesting your emotions, that's probably related to what you have gone through in early stages of life. And those different like emotional imprints that we have, they might be also obviously passed on through the ancestral imprint. Very often, especially when it comes to the mother-daughter relationship, if a mother carries certain traumas, they will be passed on to the daughter, and then it's up to the two how they want to work it out. Then we have the thyroid and the throat chakra. They are related to self-expression, being afraid to speak and express one's true self due to childhood programming may cause issues and further dysfunctions in these areas. And that's kind of like distortion in the throat, like not being able to speak, that might be also related to, of course, other lifetimes where like the freedom in many ways was suppressed. And then finally, we have the eyes and ears. They are related to avoiding to see and hear the truth about one's reality, sometimes on a very unconscious level. These issues usually derive from traumatic experiences from childhood that the identity wants to forget about. And that brings us to the last couple of slides about parenting and healing the inner child imprints. So let's take a look. What is very common when it comes to transmuting the inner child imprints is that in order to be able to overcome and integrate the inner child fragments, a conscious identity takes on the role of a parent. This very often leads to the mirroring effect, where the parent, while trying to assist his child with the problems it struggles with, actually sees a mirror reflection of its own issues. This leads a parent to start conscious work on their transmutation, which has a significant impact not only on the parent but also on the child. There are many situations during which a certain soul decides to incarnate into a certain family line to assist with transmutation of such ancestral imprints. It is one of the reasons why so many indigos chose to incarnate in families in which they experience all sorts of emotional issues or abuse. They hold enough power to transform these imprints for the entire ancestral line. So basically, this parenting is not just basically assisting the child, but in a way, you might be assisting yourself with the further transformation. When raising a child, one important question may arise: how can I help them heal and become the best version of themselves? One important thing to realize is that the ancestral imprints, once healed on a personal level, are not going to affect the future generations. That's why self-work in the healing process is essential if one wants to assist with the healing process of following generations. This process may at some point become a co-creation between the parent and the child, each one of them mirroring each other's imprints, which once consciously recognized, can be successfully healed and transformed. So in a way, it can be a beautiful co-creation between the two generations, trying to both transmute that ancestral imprint in some form. So this is everything that I wanted to share with you when it comes to the inner child. I do hope that you will find it helpful on your own personal self-healing path. I am also offering the personal inner child healing sessions if you feel like you would require some guidance during that process. So you can just check out my website and you can find the inner child healing session there if this is something that you feel like would potentially help you. But for now, I do hope that you enjoyed this video. And I am going to be back soon with a couple of interesting things that I want to share, especially when it comes to the nervous system, and also a couple of words about the upcoming energies that we will be experiencing over the next couple of months. So I wish you a beautiful rest of your day, and I will see all of you soon. Take care and bye bye.